Hi, I'm Ori Nir. I'm the spokesman of Americans for Peace Now, and I'm here today with Lara Friedman, who's the Director of Policy and Government Relations for APN. She's here to walk us through the significance and the gist of our new policy language on Iran. Lara, let's start with the following question. APN is known as an organization that deals with Israeli-Palestinian peace, Arab-Israeli peace. Why Iran and why now?
We're known as an organization that focuses primarily on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and also the Israeli-Arab conflict. But for some time now, we have had public policy positioning on Iran as well. And that reflects our concern, and it's a concern shared by, I think, most in the American Jewish community who care about Israel, about what happens in Iran. Iran has, not just with the nuclear program, certainly the most focus is on the nuclear program, but also in terms of Iran's behavior, supporting terrorist organizations, generally destabilizing behavior in the region. There are clear impacts for Israel's security and Israel's stability.
Most of the policy language that we have on Iran focuses on what should not be done. We talk about no to crippling sanctions, no to arbitrary deadlines. I'd like to ask you to flip it over and talk about what you think should be done. What should Congress and the administration do on Iran?
The first characteristic has to be realistic, which is a simple concept. Engagement must be based on realistic expectations and realistic goals. If you set out goals for engagement that are unrealistic, for example, the goal of a breakthrough in the U.S.-Iran relationship by the end of September. That goal, if it had been set in the spring when people first talked about it, was unrealistic. Iran was in a domestic political period of pre-election turmoil. That was going to be the focus. It was unrealistic to expect a change. For any policy to be effective at this time, it is going to have to be a policy that can adapt and change to what is happening on the ground in the political scene. The idea that you take one of the key U.S. national security challenges of the day and you boil it down to a black and white yes-no policy. Either you do this or we're done. Either you meet this bar or we're leaving. Doesn't make any sense. We have a dynamic situation in Iran. We have a dynamic situation in the international scene. There's a lot of, as we say, moving parts, a lot of players. There are going to be times when it will make sense to engage earnestly on the bilateral track. There are going to be times when it makes more sense to focus the energy on the multilateral track. There may be times when we have to find a good cop, bad cop scenario, playing with some of our allies.
Let's focus on the issue of sanctions. Does APN oppose sanctions as a matter of principle?
Right, and this is something I think there's been some misunderstanding about this, and I think some people have deliberately maybe misunderstood our position. We are not opposed to sanctions in principle. We have supported and continue to support a wide array of sanctions that have been already put into place against Iran. And these are sanctions that make a lot of sense. They're sanctions that are aimed at the nuclear program. They're sanctions that are aimed at the Iranian regime. And they're sanctions that are aimed at the leadership. And some people call those smart sanctions. Some people call them targeted sanctions. However you want to look at it, those are ones that you can actually make a good argument for. Whether or not they work, under the Bush administration, we actually had numerous times spoke out against new sanctions legislation. The argument there was, look, sanctions are not an alternative to engagement. They can go alongside engagement, they can strengthen engagement, but they're not an alternative. And for many years now, the U.S. approach has basically been sanctions, threats, saber rattling, whatever, with no engagement. Now we're sort of hopefully past that era. So the issue with this particular moment are these crippling sanctions. And I use the word crippling because that's the word that's used by the people who support them.
What about the issue of deadlines? Do you argue that deadlines should not be used at all?
We are opposed to arbitrary deadlines. And we mean something very specific by this. Any deadline is by nature arbitrary. But what we're talking about here are deadlines that are imposed by outside parties who are not, by outside we mean, part of the negotiating process, part of what we would hope would be a continual assessment of what is and isn't possible, of how and how it isn't working, and a consultation process with the other allies, the key stakeholders, Europeans, whoever, who are part of this process. What we are concerned about is deadlines that are not about trying to move the ball forward on the policy, but are really about trying to tie the president's hands moving forward and say, okay, after this point, you cannot continue to engage, even if it makes sense, even if what you need is not a deadline, but a shift in course, a shift in policy.
The 600-pound gorilla in the room, the issue of the use of force. Does APN oppose the use of force against Iran?
Look, we don't rule out the use of force against Iran. The point today is the casual rhetoric, whether it's coming from American policymakers or Israeli policymakers, about the resort to force is not helpful. The resort to force should be truly a last resort. Clearly, all options are on the table. No one can or should ask any sovereign government to take something off the table. They're not going to. What we need here is real, credible, sustained leadership and engagement, so the use of force is not the issue, and not the constant saber rattling that we've had in the past, which doesn't work. We strongly oppose policies that are designed to fail, because that just looks like, whether it's intended or not, you're paving the way for the use of force. We need to look for policies that are going to work. We need to look for policies that are credible. Right now, we do not need to be checking boxes on the way to policies that will legally be an act of war or an actual resort to force. We need leadership, we need serious, committed, sustained engagement, and we need to resolve this without having to go to war.
So Lara, the overarching message of our new policy language on Iran, if I understand it correctly, is the following. We've tried a certain policy in the past, it did not succeed. We have a new president who's proposing a new kind of strategy. Let's give him the room, let's give him the space to try to follow through and implement it rather than trying to speed his way through it and go through the motions of implementing such a strategy.
So at this moment, we are talking very clearly about the crippling sanctions that are being proposed, and we find it is a morally dubious path. The idea that it's okay to make individual civilians suffer as a political tool, and it is a politically perilous one. The effectiveness is highly questionable, and the unintended consequences are enormous. The potential unintended consequences are enormous.
And the full text of our policy is available on our website.
It's available on the website along with an abbreviated Q&A and then some other resources as well. And we'll be, I think, engaging in some online blogging if people want to engage with us directly on this. So we welcoming feedback, of course.
Thank you, Lara.
Thank you, Ori.